I never thought my life would become a cruel performance staged for the laughter of men who held too much power and too little humanity. My name is Evelyn. I am 28 years old, and for most of my life, I carried the weight of invisibility. Born into poverty scarred by hardship, I was the kind of woman people looked through rather than at. They saw the patched clothes, the tired eyes, the awkwardness of someone who had learned early on to shrink herself to survive. They did not see the heart that still beat fiercely inside me, yearning for dignity, for love, for a chance to matter. The night it all changed, I had no idea I was walking straight into a game I was never meant to win. He was a man they called untouchable. Alexander Kane, 35, a millionaire who wielded arrogance like a crown. He had wealth, charm, and a cruel smile that made women swoon even as it concealed his disdain. To him, life was a stage and everyone else were pawns to be moved for his entertainment. I first saw him at a glittering gala I had no right to attend. I was working as a cleaner, scrubbing the marble floors in the back while laughter and champagne spilled in the grand hall beyond. I should have kept my head down, but fate is merciless. A spilled drink, a sharp bark from a guest, and suddenly I was shoved forward into the light, my awkward face and trembling hands exposed to eyes that had never seen me as anything but furniture. The room erupted in laughter, and at the center of it was Alexander, leaning back in his chair, his eyes locked on me with something dangerous, a challenge. Later, I would learn the words he whispered to his friends that night: I could marry her tomorrow, and it would change nothing. She's so beneath me it would be the ultimate joke. His friends laughed, glasses clinking as they sealed the bet that would become my prison. When he approached me days later, his words were wrapped in silk, but dipped in poison. Evelyn. He said my name, rolling off his tongue as though he had practiced it. You deserve better than this life. Marry me. I laughed at first, certain it was mockery. But then he pressed a ring into my palm, a diamond that gleamed so bright it nearly blinded me. Hunger and exhaustion warred with suspicion in my chest. Could it be real? Could someone like him truly want me? Against every warning bell in my soul, I said yes. The wedding was a spectacle. I stood in a gown far too heavy for my frail shoulders, my reflection almost unrecognizable. The guests whispered behind fans and champagne flutes, their smirks slicing through me like knives. And Alexander, my husband, smiled, as though he had already won something far greater than my hand. I tried to convince myself it was nerves, that maybe love grew in strange soil. But the truth was already circling like vultures above me. On our wedding night, I learned the depth of his cruelty. I walked into the lavish suite, my heart pounding with a fragile hope that perhaps this union could become something real. But when I opened the door, I found him laughing with his friends, tossing back whiskey, the bet laid bare for all to hear. $1 million says I'll last a year with her, one of them jeered. Alexander raised his glass, smirking. A year? I give it 6 months before she breaks. Look at her, she's a beggar in silk. This is history's greatest wager. Their laughter was thunder, and I stood frozen, my soul tearing apart piece by piece. The ring on my finger burned like iron. Every smile he had given me, every word was a lie painted for their amusement. I was not a wife. I was entertainment. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred. Rage. It was faint at first, buried under years of silence and survival, but that night it bloomed like fire. They thought I was a joke. They thought I would crumble. But I vowed in the hollow of my chest that one day Alexander Kane would choke on the ashes of his own arrogance. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the cavernous bed staring at the ceiling as the muffled echoes of his friends' laughter haunted the corridors. Every cruel word replayed in my head, each syllable branding itself into my skin like fire. I had thought I was stepping into a life of dignity, perhaps even love, but instead, I had been cast as the punchline of a millionaire's bet. When dawn broke, I found Alexander lounging by the window, his shirt unbuttoned, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, though the sun had barely risen. He looked at me not like a husband would look at his bride, but like a man studying an experiment waiting for it to fail. Don't look so wounded, he said casually, sipping his drink. You'll get used to it, everyone does. The arrogance in his tone cut deeper than the words. In that moment, I knew he expected me to collapse, to hide, to accept the humiliation, because poverty had trained me to bow. But I refused to give him the satisfaction. I lowered my gaze not out of submission, but to hide the fire blazing in my eyes. He would never know how deeply he had scarred me, not until I chose the moment to show him. Days bled into weeks. I played the role of dutiful wife in public, smiling politely as society devoured the scandal. Whispers trailed me everywhere I went. Why her? What's the catch? I learned to bear their stares, to turn their cruelty into armor. Behind closed doors, Alexander continued his charade, treating me like a servant draped in jewels. He never struck me, never raised his voice. His cruelty was sharper. It was neglect, mockery, the constant reminder that I was unworthy. Yet I listened. I observed. And in the quiet moments, I discovered cracks in his empire. He was not the invincible man the world adored. His businesses were tied to ruthless deals, some already crumbling. His family, once his strongest supporters, were distant, fractured by secrets I could only sense, but not yet see. And Alexander himself, though he wore confidence like a second skin, I noticed the tremor in his hand when he thought no one was watching, the way he stared into mirrors too long, as though searching for something he had lost. The more I saw, the more my anger grew, not just at him but at myself. For years I had allowed the world to tell me I was nothing. But if I was truly nothing, why did he feel the need to prove himself by marrying me? Why did my existence threaten his pride so deeply that he turned it into a spectacle? One night I found the courage to ask him, "Why me, Alexander?" I whispered across the darkness of our bedroom. He didn't hesitate. "Because you're forgettable. Disposable. No one would question it if you vanished tomorrow. You were perfect for the bet." I turned my face away so he wouldn't see the tears slip down my cheeks. Forgettable. Disposable. Words meant to erase me, but instead they etched themselves into my bones as a promise. I would not vanish. I would not be disposable. I began to plan quietly, carefully. If he had married me for a bet, then I would turn that bet into his undoing. I studied his associates, their patterns, their weaknesses. I learned which accounts he kept hidden, which deals were built on lies, which friends would betray him at the first scent of failure. I smiled at him across dinner tables, all the while memorizing the small cracks in his facade. And yet, even as I plotted, I wrestled with a question I could not silence. Why did he tremble sometimes alone in his study? Why did his eyes cloud over when he thought no one was looking? Was it possible that beneath his arrogance and cruelty, there was a wound as deep as mine? I hated myself for wondering. I hated the part of me that still longed for a fragment of truth from him, something real amidst the lies. But every time I looked at the diamond on my finger, heavy and cold, I remembered the laughter of his friends. I remembered that I was a wager, not a wife. And so I buried the flicker of hope and let the fire of vengeance burn brighter. Because if Alexander Kane thought he had won, he had no idea the game had only just begun. The turning point came one evening, months into the charade, when Alexander hosted another one of his infamous parties. The mansion glittered with chandeliers and champagne laughter echoing off marble walls as men in tuxedos and women in silk gowns paraded their vanity. I had become skilled at wearing my mask by then, smiling at the right moments, lowering my gaze just enough to appear meek, while hiding the storm that raged inside me. But that night I overheard something that set my blood on fire. In the study where the cigar smoke hung thick, one of his so-called friends laughed and slapped Alexander on the back. "You've done it, Kane. The bet's already a legend. To think the great Alexander Kane shackled to a beggar. What a show. Tell me how much longer before you toss her aside." Alexander smirked, swirling his drink. "When I'm bored. 6 months was generous. She's too plain, too weak. She doesn't even know she's already lost." Their laughter rang out cruel and sharp as though I were a ghost haunting my own marriage. I stood frozen in the hallway, my fingernails digging into my palms until they nearly drew blood. Plain, weak, lost. He had no idea how wrong he was. That night when the mansion had emptied and silence draped itself over the rooms, I stared at Alexander as he loosened his tie in front of the mirror. His reflection caught mine, and for a moment his smirk faltered. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Nothing," I replied softly, turning away before he could see the rage in my eyes. Because I wasn't looking at nothing, I was looking at the cracks he couldn't hide anymore. The tremor in his hands, the hollowness in his gaze. He wore arrogance like a shield, but I had lived too long in the shadows not to recognize the weight of secrets. Over the following weeks, I began to dig. Not openly, never where he could see, but carefully, quietly. I built alliances with the staff who had long since grown weary of his disdain. I listened to the whispers of investors, the murmurs of discontent from his family. I pieced together fragments until a darker picture began to form. Alexander's empire wasn't as solid as he wanted the world to believe. His father had built it on ruthless deals, crushing anyone who stood in his way. But the foundation was rotting, and Alexander had inherited not only the wealth, but the enemies that came with it. Behind the glamour, he was a man cornered, desperate to prove himself worthy of the Kane name. One night, I caught him alone in his study, staring at an old photograph of his father. His jaw clenched, his hands shaking as he whispered, "You'll see, I'm not weak. I'll never be weak." In that moment, I understood. His cruelty, his arrogance, even the bet, it was all armor forged out of fear that he was nothing more than a fraud. And yet knowing his wound did not heal mine. If anything, it deepened my resolve. Because he had chosen to pour his pain into others, to break rather than to build. I told myself I would not make the same choice. The first step was reclaiming myself. I stopped shrinking in his presence, stopped allowing his friends to mock me unchecked. When one of them sneered at me during a dinner, I met his gaze and said calmly, "You laugh now, but you'll choke on your arrogance sooner than you think." The table went silent, and Alexander's smirk slipped for the briefest second. The second step was gathering proof, records, documents, anything that revealed the cracks in his empire. With the help of a sympathetic maid, I discovered ledgers hidden in the library, showing deals that skirted legality, transactions tied to men far more dangerous than Alexander understood. And the third step was waiting for the moment when his pride would blind him enough to slip. That moment arrived sooner than I expected. At another gala in front of hundreds, Alexander boasted of a merger that hadn't yet been sealed. He declared it inevitable, his triumph undeniable. But I knew the truth. I had seen the papers, the clauses that would never favor him. As the applause rang out, I stood there, my heart pounding, knowing the time was near. He thought the bet was his victory, but soon the entire world would watch as the empire of Alexander Kane crumbled piece by arrogant piece. And when it did, I would no longer be the beggar he mocked. I would be the woman who turned his cruelty into his ruin. The night of his downfall arrived draped in velvet and glitter, just as he liked it. Alexander thrived on spectacle, and this was meant to be his grandest. The ballroom gleamed with gold, the air thick with perfume, and the clinking of crystal glasses. He stood at the center, tall and immaculate, announcing to investors and sycophants alike that the Kane legacy was untouchable. His words flowed like champagne, smooth and intoxicating. But I had seen the documents. I knew the deal he bragged about was a house of cards. And tonight, I had ensured that truth would no longer stay buried. I stood at the edge of the ballroom. My gown borrowed my heart steady in my chest. As he toasted to his triumph, screens flickered to life around the room. The ledgers I had uncovered, the contracts he had hidden, the debts his empire had quietly drowned in, all of it, filled the air in sharp black ink. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a suffocating silence. Alexander froze, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the marble floor. His mask cracked as whispers rose like a tide swelling into a storm. Fraud, lies, debt. The same men who once cheered him now recoiled, eager to distance themselves before the ship sank. He turned to me, then, eyes blazing with a fury I had never seen. "What have you done?" he hissed, his voice breaking through the chaos. I lifted my chin, my voice calm, unwavering. I gave the world what it deserved, the truth. The humiliation that swept across his face was almost too much to bear, but I held his gaze, refusing to flinch. This was the moment I had dreamed of, the revenge I had cradled, since the night I learned I was nothing more than a bet. But even as I stood there victorious, I saw something deeper in his eyes. Not just rage, not just shame, fear. It was raw, childlike, the kind of fear that came from wounds that had never healed. In that instant, I realized I had not merely destroyed his empire. I had shattered the fragile armor of a man who had been fighting ghosts all his life. He stumbled out of the ballroom, his world collapsing in real time, and I followed not out of pity, but because some small part of me still craved answers. I found him in his study, the same place where I had once overheard his cruel laughter. His hands trembled as he clutched the photograph of his father, his voice breaking. I did everything for him, and still it wasn't enough. For a moment, silence stretched between us, heavy with years of pain and betrayal. I should have felt triumph. I should have walked away. Instead, I whispered, "And what about me, Alexander? What was I to you? A pawn? A joke? Or just another way to prove you weren't weak?" His eyes met mine, hollow and unguarded. "I thought you were forgettable, disposable. But I was wrong. You're the only one who ever saw me." The admission struck me harder than I expected. My heart, bruised and scarred, wanted to believe him, but belief was a luxury I could no longer afford. I turned away, my voice sharp but trembling. "You don't get to seek redemption in me, not after everything." I left him there, clutching his ghosts as the empire of Alexander Kane burned around him. But vengeance, I would soon learn, doesn't end with the fire. It lingers, winding its way through the ashes, forcing you to ask the question you least want to face. When the man who broke you is finally broken, what is left of you? The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines and whispers. Alexander Kane exposed, the bet that cost him everything. His downfall was public, merciless, and complete. The empire that had once glittered was reduced to rubble, investors fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. His mansion, once filled with the laughter of sycophants, grew silent and hollow. And me, I should have felt free. I should have danced in the ruins of his arrogance. Yet every night as I lay alone in the cavernous bed, I felt the weight of victory pressing on my chest like chains. I had destroyed him, yes. But in doing so, I had also bound myself forever to the story of his ruin. Wherever I went, people whispered not of my strength, but of the scandal. The beggar wife who toppled a millionaire. They laughed still, only now their laughter was tinged with awe. But awe is not love, and laughter, no matter how it shifts, still cuts. One evening I returned to the community shelter where I had once sought refuge before Alexander plucked me out of obscurity. The children ran to me, their small hands warm against mine, their laughter innocent, untouched by cruelty. For the first time in months, I felt seen, not as a scandal, not as a pawn, but as a woman, a survivor. It was there, surrounded by those who had nothing yet, gave everything, that I began to stitch myself back together. I threw myself into helping others, using what little remained of Alexander's fortune money. I had every right to claim to rebuild lives rather than destroy them. Each meal served, each bed provided, each child clothed, was a balm to the wounds I carried. Slowly I began to understand revenge had given me justice, but compassion was the only thing that could give me peace. And yet Alexander's shadow lingered. One night as rain poured against the city, I found him waiting for me outside the shelter. He was a ghost of the man I had married. His tailored suit wrinkled, his eyes hollow, his arrogance stripped bare. "Evelyn," he rasped, his voice hoarse, "I have nothing left. Not the empire, not the friends, not even the name. But I came here because I needed to see you, to..." My heart lurched, torn between fury and pity. Why, I asked, my voice sharper than I felt. To win me back, to make another bet. He shook his head, rain sliding down his face like tears. "No. To say I was wrong. About you. About everything. You were never disposable. You were the only real thing in a life built on lies." For a long moment I stood there, staring at the broken man before me. Part of me wanted to strike him, to remind him of every cruel word, every humiliation. But another part, the part that had learned compassion among the broken, saw not a monster, but a boy who had been raised in cruelty and never taught another way. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I whispered. "You don't have to," he said softly. "Just don't forget me." And then he walked away into the storm, leaving me with a heart that ached in ways I couldn't name. In time I came to realize that forgiveness isn't always about the other person, it's about freeing yourself. I didn't forgive Alexander because he deserved it. I forgave him because I refused to let his cruelty chain me any longer. Now, when I look back on the girl I was, the beggar mocked at a gala, the pawn in a millionaire's bet, I no longer see weakness. I see fire. I see survival. And I see a woman who turned betrayal into strength, humiliation into purpose. So if you've ever been laughed at, broken, or made to feel small, hear me when I say this: you are not disposable. You are not a bet. You are not the sum of someone else's cruelty. You are more. And if my story has touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment with your own story. I promise I will read it. Because in sharing, we remind each other that we are not alone.